This is My Taste is Better Than Yours, the manga podcast where Guardian Enzo and I, Samu, discuss some of our favourite series and figure out, is my taste better than yours?
Hello again, everybody. It's your old pal Guardian Enzo coming to you from irredeemably hot and humid Kyoto, Japan, with another episode of My Taste is Better Than Yours. And joining me, as always, is my co host from the lovely and expensive city of London, England. It's Samu. How are you doing, Samu?
Hello, I'm doing well. Actually, I'm too happy right now. I need to get into a mode of depression for the series that we're about to
Oh,
discuss.
you do, huh? Well, there's a
Yeah.
reason for that. The reason is the series we're talking about is Goodnight Punpun, Oyasumi Punpun, which spoiler, is one of the best manga I've ever read, but it's a lot to take. It's not a happy journey, but it is one I think we need to talk about it because we're both deeply respectful of it, and it is I think one of the most acclaimed manga of the last couple of decades, and I think there's a good reason for that. It's a seinen manga. It ran in weekly Big Comic Spirits from roughly 2007 to 2013. Asano Inio, of course, is the author and the artist, and people may know him for his current the series Dead Dead Demon Destruction, which was made into a movie, which was cut up and padded, made into a TV series. For me, Punpun is his masterwork. It's his soaring achievement as a writer. Every one of his series is good. I think Dead Dead Demon is actually his least great work, but they're all great in their own way. But this is the really the this is to me is the pinnacle of his oeuvre so far. And it's a story of Onodera Punpun, who we meet as a 11-year-old and a very innocent 11-year-old going to grammar school, and it kind of follows through him on a journey through the next decade or so, a little more of his life, his dysfunctional family, uh, imperfect to say the least parents, uh, his challenging relationships with his friends at school, with girls. It's I This is a tough one when you say describe Oyasumi Punpun in a couple of paragraphs. It's a very tough thing to do because it's not like any other series that I've read. It's very unique, and the most obvious conceit that makes it unique is that Asano uh, depicts Punpun as well, many things, but initially depicts him as like a little bird-like character, and so rather than as a human being. The other characters are generally depicted as human beings, but Punpun in particular is not. And it's a very unique series. It's a very unique series, and we'll go through our general. Even though it's an old series, we'll go through our general practice of talking about the non-spoilery general stuff, and then we'll get into the spoiler stuff later with a warning. But let's talk about first of all your general feelings about Goodnight Punpun, Samu, and about revisiting it for this particular discussion.
Yeah, this is a series that I read around the time when I started picking up manga and got more into it seriously and wanted recommendations of the best that the medium had to offer. And this is, like you say, one that is in high regard, especially online. So I read that around the time it was still publishing, so probably like 2011. So for the last 3 years of its serialization, I was keeping up with it, and I loved it back then. I thought I just there was so much about loved it in the way that I appreciated it, not necessarily enjoyed what was happening. Though the distance of time, I think, blended together my impressions or memories of the series. So I did refresh myself with a read through, a bit of a speed read, but also highlighting particular moments that I remember resonating with me. Um, and it wasn't a great experience for two reasons. One, which was, again, I just revisited and reminded myself of how dark this goes in every way, in just about every chapter, almost every chapter. But then there's also the aspect of, and this is a fear I think of rereading series that maybe once you've had great fondness for, that you discover maybe the love that you had for it is a product of the time that you consumed it. Now, my love for it hasn't disappeared. I still think it's a great series, but this was one that was in my top 10 going into our plan to record this episode, and revisiting it. It has actually fallen out of it. I think it comes down to, it's a series. It's a great series, and I wish I never read it again. Because, again, reliving everything that Pimpin went through, but also re-examining my perspective on how it shifts over time. So, I mean, did you reread it thoroughly? And what
No, I,
were
I
you
did basically,
disinclined to
yeah,
use it?
I did basically what you did. I kind of speed read it, and I picked out certain key chapters and reread those, and read the ending arc. And
Mm.
my feeling about not wanting to go back to it was kind of, I give you an example. I did an interview with Alex Dudok DeWitt, who wrote a book about the Grave of the Fireflies, which I'm sure you've seen. You've seen, right?
Yeah,
Um,
it's a fantastic film.
I mean, a fantastic film, and one which I told myself I would never watch again.
Mm.
And kind of for some of the same reasons. Um, it's a different sort of pain that it caused me than Punpun causes me, but because I never experienced, living in a country that was at war, that was bombed out, or and people were starving, and all these other things that happened in that. But the pain in Oyasumi Punpun is more personal because it's more universal, and it's not something I really was looking forward to experiencing again. Uh, and I I got the sense I get the sense from you that in rereading it, that, as you said, you still love it, but it kind of, the bloom came off the rose for the series with you a little bit. And I don't think it had that impact on me. I don't love it any less rereading it. Um, I think it would be. In fact, I did. You're the one who is very much focused on rankings and such. I know you do that on a personal level to organize your thinking, which I envy you for that. I did a top 10 manga list, as a matter of fact, for LIA, and it literally like just missed. If I had done a top 11 or at most a top 12 manga list, it would have made that list. And it, after rereading significant sections of it, I kind of feel like the same way. It would be right in that 11, 12 range on my all-time list, and which is, out of hundreds of manga I've read, that's extremely high regard that I hold it for. But as I say, um, it's a more personal sort of pain than I get from Grave of the Fireflies, because even though a lot of the things that happened to Punpun in this story didn't happen to me, obviously a lot of his discomfort is quite universal. I had a mom who would threaten suicide, and I had, who was a prescription. I don't mind sharing this with people. I mean, my mother was a prescription drug addict, and she was, a manipulative person. She would threaten suicide when she didn't get what she wanted. So in a sense, we'll get into more detail on this later. She was almost like a composite of the two parents, Punpun's two parents. And also just a lot of the things that he goes through, like his self discovery and sex, and first love and disillusionment, and you feel, you know, one thing I will say for sure about Punpun is he's an introvert, and as an introvert, I feel some of that pain too. So, let me ask you this question then, Samu, as someone who does relate to this story in pretty profound ways. Do you feel like one of the reasons this story is so highly regarded is because especially men relate to it?
Yeah, I feel like there is an aspect of the direction that Punpun's journey goes and his character. I think there are elements of it that, in the wrong hands, it could have been this sort of, I don't know, incel storyline, this incel approach to his way navigating through life and everything bad that happens to him, which, not to say that that's the audience that this series draws, because I think, like you say, there's so many elements of these tragedies or atrocities happening to or around Punpun that people can draw from their own lives. Um, and I think those are what makes the series so impactful and relatable to everyone. Um, but yeah, I think there is a particular element of how much this could appeal to young men, in particular, young men who are struggling with their identity, their place in the world. Um, so thinking back on that, it makes sense maybe that the people who are recommending this as a series and who have it in such high regard are typically, I would say, young adult men, men who are now in adulthood, who maybe are around the age Pimpin was when this came out. So, yeah, I think it touches on some topics in that way that maybe hit quite close to home for those people. Do you think it appeals to that particular sense, that mindset?
I do. I think and one of the reasons it does is because Asano was writing about his own feelings and how he felt and his own estrangement and his own disillusionment and his own fears, and I think it comes across as so authentic because it was, for him as a writer, it was very personal. In fact, he's said so that a lot of this is drawn directly from his own neuroses. And again, I think it's definitely an introvert experience too, to a certain extent. It's someone who's has an awkwardness with social interaction and being around other people. And one of the fascinating things about the narrative is it's like part of it is inside his eyes looking out, and part of it is the eyes of other people kind of looking at him. And that's a very interesting juxtaposition that Asano does, of those two different perspectives, which I think is really interesting. I personally would say, rather than people who were Punpun's age, especially in the first half or so of the series, being the core audience, I think it was mostly slightly older young men who were like in their late teens and 20s. I think that was the core audience, is people late teens and 20s who were close enough to that adolescent experience to still have the nerves and endings be a little bit raw. And it really, they were old enough to reflect on it and kind of get that sense of reflection that he was going for, but it was still recent enough in their experience that it still felt very fresh. So that's kind of who I think was the core audience for it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so yeah, it really doesn't leave out any detail. I mean, it's quite messy, and it like, it
So, like, I actually wanted to ask you a question, multiple questions, but the looking at the series in totality before we go into specific like moments that we love or have strong feelings on, do you think this borders on or falls into like trauma porn at any time, or does it remain
no,
this effective character drama? Because it's a difficult balance, I think, to achieve.
no, it never does for me. It never stops being real. It never becomes sadistic. It is a little sadistic, but it never gets to that point where, and I can think of some series that I think are inspired by this series that do. and we may even talk about one of them a little bit later in this in this episode. But I don't think Punpun ever does. I don't think he ever crosses that line personally. Do you?
Um, I think that's one of the things upon rereading it. There are times in the middle later section of the series where there's a lot happening, and there are some moments of levity and light to make sure it's not pure darkness. Sometimes maybe I feel
Mm.
like there was stretches of the series where it got so dark that it could have used that more to highlight it. I would say if I was looking back, the strongest parts of the series, in my opinion, are the beginning when they're all children, and then probably the final stretch of the series. You said this before. Having a strong beginning and a strong ending is as good a place to have that highlights for Series B. I think that is also because, particularly the beginning of the series, because of the age of the characters, there is this sense of innocence, even though we're looking through the lens of our point of view and understanding the implications of all these horrible abuses and things happening around Punpun, even if he himself is only really putting together a fraction of it. You still have those endearing moments before all the main cast of characters go on their journeys and each descend into this depth of what horrible decisions they can make that take their lives in sad, unfortunate ways. And I think, especially in the middle of the series, there was times in rereading it where I thought, "Oh, this is a lot." And the fact that I did read a good chunk of it as it was coming out, maybe that also helped me digest it better. So yes, to answer that question, at times potentially yes. I think it does go a little bit too far, though. In the end, I think it circles back, and there are effective points that are always being made.
So let's talk about, before we get to the spoilers, who are some of your favorite characters and relationships in the series?
Before I even reread it, I remember Shimizu and Seki's dynamic being one of my favorites. Um, the relationship that they have with their parents and just their outlooks on life, how different they are as people, but yet they are the perfect friend for the other. And also, I mean, it's not explicit in any way, but I think my reading of the relationship was that there's that potential for something more between them, but that was kind of unspoken, and there was this closeness, obvious closeness that they had for one another. Whether you can read that as them just being really close male friends, or whether they were in some way in love with each other, or maybe potentially just Shimizu in love with Seki, I don't know, but unfortunately, that is another relationship that for both of them does go through some rough trials, and they have their own storyline in the second half of the story, which I think is probably another aspect of the series that I'm not in love with. This
Mm.
whole end of the world, the group that they weave in and out of. Yeah, that's not one of my highlights. Even if I do, as characters, really really love them. And then another character that I just rediscovered how much I appreciate her existence within the narrative is Sachi.
Mm.
And the light, she is that light, that moment of goodness in Pimpin's life. She is, in contrast to Aiko and what she represents to Punpun and the potential for what their relationship can be like, in contrast to the darkness and where their dynamic can go, Sachi is this normal and adjusted person, relatively speaking, who makes
Relatively
who
speaking.
ma- relatively, she makes bad
Yeah.
decisions, but she feels like a person in the real world that you could have a conversation with her and talk about her life and not be aghast and gripping the table like, oh my god, this person has had this life. Like, I don't know, if you spoke to Punpun or Seki or anyone else in real life, it would probably be a lot. Whereas Sachi feels grounded in a way that, when in contrast to Punpun, brings out the best in him. But also, the existence of her character is to show that course of life that Punpun could have, or
Mm,
did have for that section of his adolescence when he was, I believe, 18 or 19 and she was in her early 20s.
mm.
You know,
Well,
it's that fork in the road, and she was the one way in which his life could have gone if their relationship
I,
stayed the way it stayed. And but the fact how it all played out, I think, is fascinating, and I'm so glad that she does exist. Without her, I do think then the series would have gone farther into the drama porn angle. I
well,
think.
I think we do have to talk about Sachi and Aiko in more detail, and in their kind of their relationships to the story and to Punpun. But I think that goes more into the spoiler category too. So I will just say that I really like Sachi as well. I think Sachi is I really found her to be like a really relatable. Uh, and in a sense, a very admirable person. As you said, she does make bad decisions. Another character I really liked actually was Harumi, which is interesting because Harumi plays a very small role for most of the series. He's not as important as Shimizu or Seki or some of the other in the friendship circle, but he's just kind of on the perimeter of it. But there was just something about him that kind of struck me right from the beginning as kind of interesting and poignant, and he ends up playing a role in the series actually that's quite significant, which I think is sort of ironic, given that he is so important. And yet, I think he's someone whose impact is bigger than his role initially in the story would appear to be. He makes a bigger impact than he has in terms of screen time. Um, Before we get into the spoiler section, I want to touch on two more points quickly. First being, um, why do you think he chose to depict Punpun the way he did? What is your answer to that question? And does it work for you as a narrative device?
I think the decision to at the beginning depict him as a bird and then adapt and always keep him something that isn't human, for me it really works because especially in his childhood, like if you want to think of it as an arc, that section of the story, it allows us to get into these touchy dark subjects while not feeling like it's too much. I don't know, to then have all that happen to a character. If that character is a squiggle on the page, I think that becomes easier to digest for the reader, and the juxtaposition, the contrast of what is happening in terms of tone versus the tone of the main character itself is um, like a very intentional conflict that I think is part of the main charm of the series. Well, not charm, but the main appeal of the series and how visually it is so bold and striking, that decision that he's made. But yeah, I think it affords him the opportunity to go even deeper because if it was a purely human character the whole way through, then the suffering might have been too much to take. Maybe in the same way that, if we bring it back to Grave of the Fireflies, seeing that happen to real children, to that real girl as well, specifically, is a lot. It's a lot to see that happen on screen. And then to
Yeah, it
remove
is.
that,
That's a very interesting way of looking at
yeah.
it.
Do
I
you do
don't
you think it's
disagree with it.
successful as well?
Yeah, no, I do, and I think I hadn't thought about it so much from the perspective of it just making it easier for him to do it without totally blowing the audience completely out of the water. But there probably is an element of that. It is somewhat less traumatic for us to see those things happen to a little bird squiggle than it is to happen to because when Asano draws people, he draws them very expressively, and he does not draw simplistic characters. He draws his character designs are quite detailed and quite and they're quite expressive. So to see that happen, yeah, I agree with you. That might have been too much to take. Now, the other question I want to ask you, and I've seen various people weigh in this, is do you think Oyasumi Punpun ever could be made into an anime? And there's a couple of obvious challenges here. The narrative structure of it is very atypical. It's very singular. Then you have the whole issue of the conceit of the way Punpun is depicted, and then just the content is it is really rough. It's really edgy. And yet it is a series that's almost universally critically revered and is, was extremely popular when it was released. It's a very well known, very popular manga. Do you think it ever could be made into an anime? Not saying it will, but assuming someone had the interest in doing it, do you think it could, or is it just simply too many hurdles to
I
overcome?
think it's definitely possible. I can see a world where it exists, whether it be received well, just because, like you say, there's so many opportunities where it could fall. I think it's kind of this weird, awkward length as well, where if it was 2 cores, for example, it might be too tight. If it was 3 cores, it might it might not exist if it's going to be that long in the first place. Um, but yeah, I can imagine as well some sort of, if, even on a visual level, playing around with multimedia aspects, incorporating what all seem to be like photorealistic backgrounds, live action with animation. Like you have the photorealistic stuff in the manga. Um, yeah, I think there are a lot of really good opportunities for creative flexing in an adaptation like that. Whether people, yeah, whether it ever will, I doubt it. I don't think it will happen. But yeah, I think I would like to see it. Would you like to see it, or are you
I
again?
would
You would.
absolutely. If it was well done, it would be an extremely, painful, difficult experience. But I think it could be even more. It could be even more viscerally disturbing as an anime than it is as a manga. But there is
Hmm.
something kind of spare and beautiful about the way he depicts it in manga form that I think you would risk losing that. There's just something. There's something slightly alien about it,
Hmm.
and I think it, the risk of depicting it into an anime would be the same as 20th Century Boys. I think that is a manga, a wonderful manga that you would risk losing something of the essence of what makes it great in transitioning it from the page to the screen. I don't know, but I would love to see somebody try, because even if they made an adaptation of it and it didn't work, it wouldn't lessen my love for the manga any. And if it was great, well, who knows, that could be like an all time.
The fact that we now have an Inio Asano anime in existence and da 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 da,
Yeah, yeah.
I think all opens that opportunity. I mean, that is a series that is very different, and I think it's worth noting because you did not, from your experience and a few episodes of the anime, I believe you did not enjoy it. I feel like if we're comparing Inyo Sano's early works, so anything including Punpun and before then, to what he does now, which is da 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 da, and his current series, which is Mujina Into the Deep, you know, you have what is essentially a sci-fi slice of life with mild sci-fi elements playing around in the background, and um, then Mujina the Deep, which I haven't actually read, so I can't comment in great detail. But I feel like it's and maybe not straightforward, but it embraces action in a way that he hasn't before. Quite combat focused, and I don't think it's had the same love that fans of his previous series has given, even though it seems to be doing quite well, I think, in terms of performance. So I think Asano has intentionally shifted towards a different tone, maybe to
Mm.
escape from that dark and depressing headspace that you have to be in for all the type of series that he's done. He's done Solo Nin, and there was various other one shots and single volume series before Punpun. Um, so maybe his newer series are the ones that are more likely to get picked up in anime form, if we're being realistic, anyway.
Yeah, he's entitled. I will say personally, I think the change as a writer, I don't think it's a change for the better. I don't think his more mainstream popular works, well, populist works, if you will, I don't think they have the same core of brilliance that his earlier, more edgy stuff like Solanine and Punpun have. But who am I to say? I mean, he got himself an anime that he probably never would have had otherwise. Good on him. Maybe he's just happier now than he was then, and that's certainly possible. He was in his 20s when he started Punpun. He was a very young man. He was in his early 20s when he started Solanine. He may have just grown out of that depressed phase that he was in when he was writing those series. And that's all legit. I mean, I don't begrudge him that. I don't find his later stuff to be nearly as compelling. But that's a matter of subjective taste, really. All right, let's jump into the spoiler discussion. And with Oyasumi Punpun, the majority of the spoiler discussion is really about the ending, so we'll certainly talk about that. But there's a lot of things that happen in between. Like for example, we have his uncle Yuuichi, who has a girlfriend, uh, who
A 16-year-old girlfriend.
yes, well, yeah, yeah. I mean, she's he well he has a 16. She's older than that by the time she becomes his like live-in. But he has his uncle Yuichi, who is generally, I will say, is treats Punpun better than almost any other character in the series, and he's good to Punpun.
Mm.
But he's also, he's hardcore, like, sexual addict. He has a thing for young girls. And one of his girlfriends is Midori, who kind of takes almost a surrogate mother role with Punpun when his own mother is, as she often is for various reasons, and including ultimately death, is absent from his life. And then I don't think can it be said any other way that she rapes him when he's in middle school.
Mm.
And I think that is the single event that probably fucks him up more than anything else that happens in his life, actually. Um, so I kind of think that was the thing that really pushed him. Finally, that was like the final nail in the coffin, as they say, kind of pushed him in a direction of just kind of being lost and dysfunctional. So, what is your read on that moment? What impact do you think that had on his life?
I think it has immense impact, and it sets him off on the messy course of life that he is on by the time we meet him. And like you say, he is much more sympathetic than the original parents Pimpin that we're introduced to. Um, yeah, I also think when you compare his arc or his looking at his past and the present time in the story as well, with how Pimpin's journey goes, I think is there to mirror how things happen between both of them. This generational continuation of horrible things happening to and around a person, and how that pushes that person to make these decisions that continue this cycle of just violence and all
Mm.
these bad things that are happening. Yeah, I will say that stretch was maybe my least favorite in the series. I just found it uncomfortable, even more than a lot, even more than what came before and after it. So yeah, I think that was also part that I'd not blocked out my memory, but wasn't as fresh.
Mm. Now, so let me ask you this question. Let's talk a little bit more about Sachi and Aiko. So I'll ask the question. I'll phrase it in this form. Sachi and Aiko, did either or both of them love Punpun, and did he love either or both of them? And I have my own feelings about that. I'll say I think it's pretty clear to me that Sachi loved Punpun, uh, but it could be argued that she had a more selfish interest in him, given her own profession, which was a mangaka. And then, as terms of, I don't think he ever loves her, in my personal opinion. I think he realizes on some level that he's better with her, that she's good for him, and I think he genuinely, he likes her as a person, but I don't think he ever loves her. He absolutely loves Aiko, uh, even knowing that loving her is terrible for him. I don't think Aiko ever loves him until the very end, and it's ironically when she does realize that she loves him that she takes that as the time her realizing that she is among all the fucked up characters in this story. She may be the most, but um, when the realization that she loves him is the impetus for her to take her own life, because she then realizes if she loves him, she has to free him from her, which is that's some dark shit, man. But I honestly think that's how I interpret that whole sequence of the story. So, what's your read on the two girls in the story? Do they love him, and does he love them, and just generally how that relationship works? What's your take on that?
Obviously, Punpun really loved Aiko, and I think Aiko loved Punpun, but they they loved each other in the only way that they thought they could love someone, maybe, which was just destructive and bringing the other down to their level in ways that just pushed the level of uncomfortability between them. But I feel like that was also what they were so conditioned to see as love. So that is why it worked between them, no matter how just awful and from an outside perspective, abusive and everything that went wrong with their relationship from what we see. I think with Sachi, yeah, I kind of agree. I think she did love him or love the idea of him, whereas um, Punpun wanted. I think Punpun saw the life that could be with Sachi and experienced that in part. But again, if he doesn't view love as something positive and how he
Right.
can have that relationship with someone, I don't think maybe he ever viewed it as love. He just viewed it as this other different idea that wouldn't have been fulfilling to him if he stuck with that life.
She
Yeah.
represents normalcy, really, in a way.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think.
Her, and then you also touch on Harumi as well. Um, yeah, those two, without those um, contrasts to like compare with all those two compared with Aiko and Punpun, I think paints the full picture of the experience of growing up in adolescence and all these different ways that your life can play out. Yeah, when we talk about the very ending, I have some curious
Yeah.
thoughts on Harumi as well.
All right, now let me ask you this question, which I hadn't written down, I hadn't planned to ask, but it just kind of popped into my head as we were talking. Do you think one of the messages Asano is sending is that love itself is kind of unhealthy, and looking for it is what leads us mostly into problems? And if we kind of stopped so hard looking for love and quote unquote settled for other things in life, that we might actually be happier without having to drag that weight around?
Uh, no, I would say he's more focusing on if a person is conditioned in their upbringing and way of life to view love in that way, then how toxic love can be and applied to your life. And yeah, so much of it, so much of yourself and your identity and your personality is from your parents, the people who raised you, your environment, everything that combines together to make you, as well as just your inner self. And when you have those tainted influences that destroy these concepts, then those concepts themselves become destructive, which is, I think, I don't know Inio Asano's life story. I don't know his exact headspace when he was writing this series and other before, but I would hazard a guess that based on the content of a lot of them, that he was in a dark place, or he thought about these subjects on a deep level. I feel like that's the type of story he was trying to push. I don't know how much maybe he did relate with that aspect of not being able to find love, or how that can just taint your worldview in the same way that maybe his his change in direction in terms of tone as an author, as a writer and an artist over the years has adjusted to a different mindset, then maybe that also goes to show that what happens with Pimpin in the end can also be viewed in a positive way. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, I don't
it's an
know.
interesting
I don't know if
point.
you want to jump in the ending now, but especially since I revisited the series, I remembered that people have different views on the ending in terms of whether it was good or bad for
Mm.
Punpun
Yeah,
himself. I mean,
I I I consider it bittersweet is how I would describe it.
mm,
I just in practical terms, what happens is uh, Punpun and Aiko have this incredibly dysfunctional relationship, and effectively, her mother tries to kill her. He saves her from her mother, who stabbed her or tried to stab her, and in the process, he he thinks he's killed her, but he hasn't. And then she then kills her mother, but lets him go on thinking that he did it. So he thinks he's a murderer, and in fact, he's not. And in fact, he was defending her from someone trying to kill her. And then eventually, as I said, they go on the run. And what eventually happens, is at least my interpretation of it, is um, you know, she comes to realize through a series of events that she actually does love him. And then it's at that time when she realizes that she loves him that she decides to take her own life, because she realizes that he needs to be free of her. And eventually, he keeps moving on the run, and eventually this catches up to him. And so the ending itself, let's talk about it. There's a time skip there, and we get these other characters like Harumi, who had been out of the story for a long time. He gets looped back into things, and he's living a normal life, but his life is not perfect either. He's about to get married, but it's pretty obvious that he realizes that there's a certain kind of emptiness, a hollowness to his existence. But he's always been kind of like the normal one in the group, and so he kind of has a certain satisfaction in that life of his. And then he randomly runs into Punpun on the street in Tokyo, in Shibuya, actually. And uh, it seems like um, it seems like Punpun is with Sachi. I mean, he is with Sachi. And Harumi pointedly says, "Oh, wow, you got married, huh?" And he doesn't answer, but Harumi realizes from the lack of answer that the answer is no, they didn't get married. Nevertheless, they are together physically. She has her kid, um, and in the final analysis, they say goodbye. Harumi says goodbye to Punpun, and Punpun says goodbye to Harumi. And the last vision Harumi sees of Punpun, he's back to looking like he did when he was an 11-year old. And some people take that as a kind of an upbeat ending, in the sense that that Punpun is finally like realizing that even if he doesn't love Sachi, even if he's not in love with his current existence, he has to put what happened with Aiko behind him and accept that happened and it's in the past. And if you choose to live on, you have to live on, and that's what he's bitter with the sweet. He's choosing to live on. I kind of feel like that's where Asano is going with that ending. Is that Punpun is at least, for better for worse, even if he's not happy, he's at least making the decision that he has to accept that the past is the past, and he has to live his life, and he's choosing to live his life whatever happens. So what's your spin on the ending?
I think my take on the ending, because the scene where he waves away to him, the double spread, and then you see a tear in Pimpin's eye as well. I think a lot of people
Mm.
take that as a moment of Pimpin being genuinely sad with the life that he has. And from what I do understand, there might have been an interview that Asano gave after the series where he described the ending as being the worst possible ending for Pimpin. So maybe his intention was to show that Pimpin is suffering through life by not following through in the suicide that Aiko was offering
Mm.
him. But the fact that he's now chosen to live through the life, yeah, I think a lot of people do see it as quote unquote worst ending where he's pushing through his existence. I don't really take it as that. I take it as there is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, that there is sign for someone to grow and change, and reach happiness, even if they go through all these horrible things in life. So yeah, my initial takeaway from when I read it the first time, and also in rereading it recently, was that it was more positive for Punpun than negative. Then again, the author's intention can mean very little, I suppose, when you have something is open
Yeah.
ended as that as well, and how people interpret it.
So regarding specifically Asano's take on the ending, I do think that later on, I think he gave a more nuanced answer to that question. But I really think what he initially said is that because it's harder to live than it is to die, so he was thinking he was giving Punpun the more painful ending because he had to live, and he had to live with the pain. I think in later comments he was a little more nuanced in his feelings on it, and I actually think his own feelings about the ending might have evolved some as he got a little bit older. He might now view the ending a little differently than he did when he wrote it. That's entirely possible.
Yeah,
But
potentially.
again, as you said, the author's feelings about the ending are, in a sense, irrelevant because once he writes it, it's up to the reader to decide. It's not up to him to decide. All he does is put words on a page. It's up to the reader to decide what they mean. And I think you hit on the essence of the truth. Now, do you feel disappointed that we never got to see? In fact, one of the ending scenes, one of the final panels, he actually hides it with a speech bubble. But what do you think of never seeing Punpun's face? Are you okay with never seeing it, or would you rather we had seen it?
I would have rather we saw it, but that's just I don't know if it detracts from the series in any meaningful way. It was just this thing where, especially as the series went on, you got to see more and more of the human features of his face without ever getting the full picture, and he was being
Hmm.
depicted more and more human as well. So yeah, but then also that regression to him back to the bird at the end, I think, is very intentional and is effective in its own way. Though there is that part of me that wishes I just got to see his face one time. Um,
Okay.
yeah. What about you? Do you have any like strong feelings at all
I'm
about that?
I'm not strong feelings, but I never at the time I read it, I never thought, oh, that sucks. I'm surprised
Yeah.
we didn't get to see it. And in retrospect, I'm happier we didn't. I think it's better that he leaves that as again now whatever we bring to it ourselves. You know,
Hmm.
he doesn't
It
tell us
shows more
what
restraint
to
on
see
his
in
part as
Poon
well, I
face.
think.
We have to imagine it ourselves. I think that's kind of he preserved something unique about the series by not taking it away at the end. So I think in that sense, I'm happier not to have seen the face.
Yeah.
Now, there is one other interesting element at the end that we hadn't talked about, which is that Sachi shows at some point, maybe not at the very end of the story, she shows Punpun a picture of the manga she has in mind, and it looks very familiar to us. And so it's pretty clear that in some sense that Punpun is the protagonist of a manga that Sachi is writing. And my question to you is, was it the intention that we were to take away from this that the entire story was her manga? Or was that just simply something that was happening in the moment? What was your reading on that?
I didn't take it as this is literally the story for manga. There's a possibility. I think I read it more as her mining the trauma and everything bad that happened to him, or these things that happen to us in real life, and turning it into fiction. Maybe in the same way that Sano did with the story, drawing any real experiences or yeah, anything that he was referencing. That could have just been more of a broad take on the creator of a story
Hmm.
taking influence from real
Do you
life.
feel like she was exploiting him at all by doing that? Do you think that was exploitative on her part, or do you think that's, or were
Mm,
you okay with it?
no, I don't think it was. But as far as you know, the idea of is using anyone's real story exploitative in a piece of
Hmm.
fiction. I think in this case, I would say no. But then that opens up the more broad question of how appropriate it is to use other people's stories for fiction.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. All right. So that's a very complicated discussion of a very complicated manga It inspires some very complicated feelings in and there's one more element of the ending too, which is like there's a scene where Harumi goes to school where he's a teacher, and we kind of see the introductory scene of the manga kind of repeating itself. And that's sort of a message that's going out there of like you mentioned earlier about the generational thing, like happening with Yuuichi and then with Punpun, and now we even see it. So maybe he's kind of telling us that these things. There's no end to the suffering. Basically, it just cycles itself over and over again. All right, let's talk about recommendations. I'll let you go first this time. What would be your recommendation? This was a tough one for me, but what was your recommendation for another series for Oyasumi Punpun?
I'm going for another series that tackles, I think, complicated feelings on adolescence and goes into dark subject matters. That's The Flowers of Evil, Akunohana by Shuuzou Oshimi. No, from what I recall, you do not have favorable feelings about this series, so there is a good chance that if anyone reads this off the back of Punpun, they also might feel that way. Though I get the sense that there is a shared audience in both these series.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the author, I think Oshimi, is much more sensational in his approach to these dark themes. And when I brought up the question of whether it's trauma porn or whether it's like a character drama, the balance is a lot messier there, I would say. And he's another author where he has plenty series that are quite dark in the themes that he's exploring. So yeah, if that is something that you're looking for outside of Asano's earlier works, I would say that does make sense as a place to jump off of. And again, even though you'd greatly disagree on this, I do think the Flowers of Evil, the Akunohana anime, is really, really good. In fact, it's great. I think it's the superior version of the story. And even though the rotoscoping aesthetic is of great contention and a lot of people really hate it, I think in the same way that Punpun is effective in showing the realism of the world, like the photorealism and how it feels like it could be depicting a reality that is happening to all these characters. I think the choice of having the rotoscoped people animated is effective in the uncomfortableness of what happens in the Flowers of Evil. And I think, it's an ugly series, and even if visually at some points it does look ugly, I think it benefits the narrative. And I can't remember what episode it was exactly, but the one where they paint the big like painting explosion in the classroom. I think that is the point where I was like, oh, the anime is actually, I think, better than the manga, even though I think fans of the manga would crucify me for saying that.
um, it's funny because when you mentioned the trauma porn earlier, my mind immediately went to the Akanohana, the Flowers of Evil, and thought, now there's a series that does cross over the line and does be a provocative for the sake of being provocative and trauma porn for the sake of trauma porn. To me, I will say this: I'm equal opportunity. I hate both the manga and the anime, but for different reasons. Um, I get what you're saying about the ugliness of the story and the characters kind of being reflected in the rotoscoping, but to me, it's just since the story didn't work for me and the characters didn't work for me, that was just like compounding the fracture, if you will. None of it works for me. I think it's completely inauthentic, and it has none of the core of pathos that Punpun has. I just think it's an author, trying to be provocative for the sake of being provocative. Kind of an act of, literary masturbation in a sense. But, a lot of people love that series, and I'm certainly, I don't know if I'm in the minority on it, but I know that if you ever look and say, what should people read if they like Punpun? I think Flowers of Evil is usually the first series on the list, and I think there is a reason for that. There is definitely an overlap in approach that I think you've hit the nail on the head. It just one works for me and the other doesn't. So for my recommendation, since we don't, as you said, we have our unwritten rule, I would have been tempted to recommend Solanine actually, or Not Simple. is another series, not by the same author, but that's another one now that I think about that. It would have been a good recommendation. But Solanine by Asano would have been a good pick. I also thought about 20th Century Boys because it has a sort of a similar narrative style, and there's a similar kind of a subplot there too. That's actually very similar. But in the end, I went with maybe a lesser known series called The Climber, Koko no Hito. So The Climber is about it's a story of a man who it starts when he's very young in school, and follows him through much of his life, much as Punpun does, and he's has his very socially awkward person. He's adrift in life and finds meaning in mountain climbing. This is what gives him meaning to his life. So, but it has a lot of similarities to Punpun in that it exists in and out of his consciousness, and it does a lot of similar mind games that Asano does. Very striking art style. Although the art style reminds me almost more of Takehiko Inoue and like a vagabond art style. But I think it's very interesting, very weird series that has a lot of thematic overlap and some stylistic overlap with Punpun. So that would be my pick: is Koko no Hito, The Climber. And but if you want to read 20th Century Boys, that's an even better series, and I do think you'd get some similarity there too. We need to give our scores here, and my score for this series is 95, and a very high score. And as I said earlier, it would be just outside my all-time top 10, but 95, a very high score. How about you, Samu?
Yeah, like I said, upon rereading the series, I think my love for it went down just ever so slightly, reducing from my top 10 into like top 20, top 30 territory. Before, I would have been around where you are, but now I would give it a 91.
Okay, thank you very much, Samu. Thank you very much for joining us.
Likewise, likewise. I think this was a great series to discuss, and yeah, we got a good amount out of it.
Okay, everyone, hang in there. Try to stay cool, stay hydrated, and it's been great being with you this evening. Have a good evening, and more than ever in this weather, stay frosty.